Well, praise the Lord. Looks like it's my turn. I have it in my heart to begin a not exhaustive study on the subject of Abraham to Zion, as Pastor referred to it in the bulletin, A to Z. And I thought that was appropriate, A to Z. But, my heart soars with admiration towards Abraham. And as I began to get in this study, I began to respect him even more for the wonderful character and the wonderful faith that he exhibited. Abraham was a man who could dismiss circumstances in order to believe God. He could easily dismiss the circumstances in order to believe God. And that's really kind of one of the imports of the study. As we get into this, we're going to have 3 classes here, and in a minute I'll define kind of the subject matter of each class. But Abraham embraced, or what I should say, embodied characteristics that we need to strive for. In case we didn't realize, as the days go on, Christianity itself is going to come under attack. The promises of God are going to come under attack. And everything that God has promised to me and to you, to the church, to the fellowship, all are going to come under attack. And we're going to need to be able to embrace this characteristic of Abraham, to be able to dismiss circumstances. This is a beautiful quality that creates peace in the life. When, you hear from God and it produces faith within you. There's a line in a show that we like to watch on Sherlock Holmes, and the BBC version of Sherlock Holmes. And in this particular case, Sherlock and another client or another person with him is trying to convince this woman how that this marriage that she's about to embark on will be disastrous for her. And her comment in reply to him, which is a bad comment, but I'm going to apply it in kind of a positive way here, if I could, borrow it from the circumstance and put it in something else. But she said, "Your opinion and all of the world's opinion is no more to me than the tweeting of those birds out this window." And I like that, actually. I like that very much. We want to come to the place where the things that God has spoken to us are the things that matter. And everything that the world says to us, and even sometimes well-meaning brethren say to us, are no more to us than the tweeting of the bird outside. You fixate on what God has spoken. And this was the quality of Abraham. He was able to fixate on that. Now, this Abraham to Zion obviously covers, hundreds of years. And so in fact, it covers about 1,000 years. But we're not going to obviously go into great detail about that because we want to segment this up and we want to keep the flow here. But we study, and rightfully so, we study the journey of the children of Israel, and we take it from Egypt to Zion. But actually, it's really much broader than that. The journey to Zion doesn't begin when they leave Egypt. The journey to Zion begins with Abraham. Because, and we'll develop this here. And even Moses himself says this. In Exodus chapter 32, verse 10, the children of Israel had displeased the Lord, and the Lord said, "Now, therefore, let me alone, that my wrath may wax hot against them, and that I may consume them, and I will make of thee a great nation." And Moses responds. He gives them several responses. I'm only going to pick one of them out here, but there's a flurry of verses here that Moses recites to the Lord. But verse 13 is the one that I want to read. Moses says, "Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants." He directs the Lord back to the covenant that he made to Abraham because he knows the journey doesn't start with him. This journey is a journey that began with Abraham. Abraham is the birth of the nation. Abraham is the birth of the nation. "Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, thy servants, to whom thou swearest by thine own self, and saidst unto them, I will multiply your seed as the stars of heaven, and all of this land that I have spoken of will I give unto your seed, and they shall inherit forever." You want to know why Moses was the meekest man in the earth? It's because he's completely devoid of pride here. He's only looking out for Abraham's best interest and the Lord's best interest. And so the journey really doesn't begin with the departure from Egypt. It makes a great allegory, and it's beautiful because it's our departure from Egypt and the experiences through. It gives a vision to the church to tell us that God desires to take the church through each of the feasts, culminating with the Feast of Tabernacles, which actually brings us also to Zion. So the journey doesn't really begin post-Egypt. It doesn't really begin at Egypt. It really begins with Abraham, because what God eventually created, bringing the people of God into the land that flowed with milk and honey, that wasn't the promise that originated with Moses. That was a promise that originated with Abraham in Canaan. And so the writer of Hebrews picks up on the surety of Abraham's promises. And this is kind of the foundation to what we're saying here is this. This is what I hope to impart to the hearers of these classes. What I hope to impart to them is when God's promises are called into question, it's God's character that's called into question. When people doubt God's promise, it's really God's character that's being called into question. And the point that we're going to make is this, that God promised something to Abraham, and 1,000 years later, it was fulfilled in the very spot that God gave the promise to Abraham. So immutable is the promise of God. Immutable, that's one of those King James words. Immutable means it can't be broken. It cannot be broken. It can't be broken. It's immutable. The thing that God spoke to Abraham. And by the way, if we're just talking about Abraham, it's not totally meaningful to us. But what is also immutable is the promise that God gave to you. What has God promised you in your life? The promise that God has given to this church, physically, this body, is immutable. The promise that God has given to this fellowship, it's immutable. It doesn't change. That's the import of the study. And so in Hebrews chapter 6, verse 13 to 14, for when God made promise to Abraham because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless thee, and multiplying I will multiply thee. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 17 and 18. I may go through these rather quickly here because 45 minutes is the limit. We hope to be 44:30 actually, but I didn't actually look at the clock when we started. You guys up in the booth, give me a wave when we get close to 40. But at any rate, we're trying to get less than that, Pastor. You understand that. But Hebrews chapter 6, verse 17 to 18. Wherein God, willing more abundantly to show unto the heirs of promise the immutability of his counsel, confirmed it by an oath, that by two immutable things in which it was impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation. Let that sink in. That we might have strong consolation. Not just a little pat on the shoulder and say, oh, no, God's going to fulfill his promise. But a bold declaration that resonates within our spirits. The consolation of faith. That we might have strong consolation who have fled for refuge, lay hold upon the hope set before us. And so this study is all about the immutability of God's promise and seeing his promise fulfilled and staying on the path until you see it happen. You know, when God gives a promise to someone, to anyone, to an individual, to any church around the world, you know, we're talking about God speaking a promise to them. If that person doesn't see that promise fulfilled, then something went wrong. Now, I want to qualify that for just a moment because much of what God promised to Abraham, he didn't see. And that's okay. And we'll explain that. He didn't see it because it was for future generation, but it was still the promise of God. Abraham wasn't around 1,000 years later when Zion was established by King David. But it was the fulfillment of what God spoke to Abraham. Absolutely was. And the beautiful part, you know, of Abraham and of the heroes of faith is that even though they didn't see it, they continued to believe. This is the generation that we're in. We're in a generation of naysayers and doubters. You know, people that just absorb doubt and seem to have a propensity for it. What utter nonsense is that? Where is that going to take anyone? No, Scripture talks about strong consolation. You know, the things that God has spoken, I have this later on in my notes, but I'll just share it here. But the things that God has spoken, I I have no guarantee that I'm going to see them fulfilled in my lifetime. And you want to know something? I don't really care. I know who promised it. I know the one who promised it. And when I stand before Jesus Christ, I want coming out of my lips, I waited. Do you think that I'm going to be disappointed? Do you think that the rewards are going to be any less because I didn't see some earthly thing take place? I waited. You know, waiting for him is loving him. And Abraham waited with hope and expectation, and yet it was for generations off. He wasn't even going to see it in his lifetime. There are things that God spoke to me. In fact, he brought this back to me as I was doing this, putting this study together. Something that God spoke to me just months after I started attending this church. Just months. It wasn't actually this church. It was Pittsburgh Avenue Fellowship back then. But just months after I started attending the church, God gave a promise to me. And you know something? I still haven't seen it fulfilled. I guess I'm crossing the 4-decade threshold here. So let's see, 81. We're 41 years now. Actually, February, I think, marks 41 years, because I think it was February when you did your... I think it was March. Okay, we'll wait till the end of the March to make that declaration then. But I still haven't seen it. But you know something? This doesn't bother me. It doesn't bother me in the least bit. I have strong consolation. And even this morning as I'm sitting in my Queen Anne's chair, the Lord is reminding me of what he spoke then. Why he's chosen to wait that long? It's none of my business, to be quite honest about it. And I don't care. It beats within my heart, and I have strong consolation. I remember one time saying to Pastor Daniel here, I've known Danny, since you were about 14, 13 years old? And I said, if there'll ever be any secret to my success, which I'm not aspiring to great success, but if there's any secret to my success, it's going to be just because I'm dumb enough to believe that God can do it. Have you ever remember me hearing saying that? Something like that? Yeah. And maybe more emphatically than that, too. But I am dumb enough to believe it. You know what? I don't want to be smart enough that I don't. I want to be that smart. And so the immutability. Now, giving you just an outline of the classes here. Class 1 really is about Abraham and the immutability of God's promise. The whole nation is a product of what God spoke to Abraham. The nation is not a product of what happened in Egypt. It's not. It's called Israel. Who was Israel? Israel was, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, who later was called Israel. It's the nation of Israel. It's the nation that's founded under the promise that was given to Abraham. And so the promise flowed through Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Moses, Joshua, Samuel, David, and Solomon. The promise continued to flow all the way through. And by the way, the last class, we're going to see that it actually jumps, because then it is now attached to the church. And we're going to find that the second coming takes place actually very close to where God spoke to Abraham. Now, Jesus Christ is greater than Abraham, you understand it, but you see the line that God put Abraham in. The line that he put him in, the honor that he gave to this man. And then the second class is really about the journey and the judges. Now, we have, basically, we're jumping huge gaps of time here, you understand, of course. The journey and the judges. And it's going to be, next week is going to be about those who disqualified themselves from remaining in the line. You see, the line and the promise is given, but there are qualifications. When we talk about Psalm 15 and Psalm 24, we're talking about the qualifications of those who will ascend Zion. There has to be a discussion of those who disqualified themselves. And so next week, and it won't all be about that, we'll put some brighter lights in it than that, but in spite of the naysayers, and the unfaithful, God's promise to Abraham continued. And then the third class is really going to focus more on Samuel, David, Solomon, and Zion. And when I did my teaching on the judges in the Philippines a month or so ago, however long ago it was, I came to appreciate the beauty of Samuel. The beauty of Samuel. There was nothing like Samuel for 350 years when Samuel came on the scene. And so from there, it continued. And then we had the installation of the monarchy, and then we have the establishment of Zion. And then, which may actually even be more important than David's tabernacle, we have the building of Solomon's temple. But David's tabernacle, and I've got the man who wrote the book here so he can correct me if I'm wrong, David's tabernacle really is for the church age. Solomon's temple is for the millennium. We're going to focus in on that because actually Solomon's temple, as we will see, is actually a fulfillment of what God spoke to Abraham. And by the way, in the very spot that Abraham offered Isaac is where Solomon's temple was built. And so, Mount Moriah. But again, this is talking about how that God spoke to a man and gave him a promise. And millennia later, God still remembered that promise and still fulfilled that promise. The immutability of God's promises. And so, Genesis, we'll start in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2. Again, we're going to be just jumping through this because there's a lot of stuff to cover here, and we're just trying to make a very linear point here. In Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 and 2, now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And so we will see God fulfill this promise against all odds. And it's interesting, actually, as you do a study of the development of the children of Israel and of their entire history, you will find that Abraham's promise, and this is an important point. When I was putting this together, I felt that this was really a critical point. Abraham's promise was given to Abraham. It passed to Isaac, it passed to Jacob, and it passed through that line that we mentioned earlier as we followed it through. It involved Egypt, 400 some years in Egypt. It involved the 40 years in the wilderness. It involved the 350 years during the time of Judges, where actually you wonder if Israel ever is going to make it out. It's a time of great apostasy, a time of great darkness, when every man is doing that which is right in their own eyes. And then at the end of that period emerges Samuel, a bright shining light, and then things get clear again. And then we have, to endure the reign of Saul, and then David is put into place. And David takes Jerusalem, which was possessed by the Jebusites at that time. David establishes his palace within the city of David, and we have the establishment of Zion in the city of David. And then from there, we have now progression during the time of Solomon. We call it Solomon's temple, and rightfully so. It is Solomon's temple. He built it, but it really actually was more David's than it was Solomon's. I mean, the concept was David. In fact, Solomon even says himself that I'm in my father's stead in building this temple. I'm in my father's stead. And so, David made the plans. David provided a lot of the materials and everything else for the building of Solomon's temple. It was actually in David's heart to build God's a house, and God put the brakes on it for David, but said, Solomon, your son, will build the house. And so now we have this complete circle here where Solomon's temple, one of the most glorious parts of Israel's history, taking place on the very spot where Abraham offered Isaac, the threshing floor of Ornan, where David actually, when David was being judged because he counted the children of Israel, which was not permitted, during the time of judgment, David actually saw the angel of the Lord standing on that place. And Ornan saw it too, and he was fearful. But this was the very place where, we've come full circle. 1,000 years has elapsed. Egypt, wilderness, apostasy of the time of the judges, the creation of, or I should say the bringing forth of Samuel, the creation of the monarchy, David taking the city which they said he would never take, and the establishment of it, and then the building of Solomon's temple, which was a glory to the world. A glory to the world. God was magnified throughout the world because of the temple of Solomon. There was nothing quite like it. This is the immutability of what God promises. And so what I have a burden in my heart for during the course of this study is that we would hold fast to the things that God has spoken. Look at what happened here and how God still continued to fulfill His word. Leaders come and leaders go. Israel rises, Israel falls. There's the wilderness, there's the oppression of Egypt, all of that. None of it could stop God from fulfilling what He spoke to Abraham. So it is Abraham to Zion. It is an Abraham to Zion. That is the message, Abraham to Zion. And many today are losing faith in God's ability to keep His promise. We're looking outside, and we're looking at what's happening outside, and we're trying to use our own intellect to interpret what's going on. But we have to hold fast to the things that God has spoken. You'll become fearful and afraid. You'll exercise bad judgment if you get focused on the world. And as a result, you get taken off the path. In Class 2, we'll focus more about that. We have to be convinced, folks, at the very core of our being, unequivocally. You talk about giving yourself over to something. We need to give ourselves over to what God has spoken to us. We need to commit to what God has spoken and give ourselves to it. We have to be convinced that when God gives to man, it gives to a man, gives to a work, gives to a fellowship, gives to a nation a promise. It's immutable. The only thing that can prevent that promise from coming to pass is ourselves. Well, it will still come to pass. It's just that we might not be part of it. In Isaiah chapter 55, verses 10 and 11, it's a familiar verse to us here. For as the rain cometh down and the snow from heaven, and returneth not thither, but watereth the earth, and maketh it bring forth and bud, that it may give seed to the sower, and bread to the eater, so shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereunto I sent it. When we doubt the promises of God, I mean collectively I don't necessarily mean this church, but when we doubt the promises of God, in actual fact, we're doubting the character of God. We're doubting His character. Is God as good as His word? I'm not going to lie. I've gone to my prayer closet and I've said, Lord, this promise that you've given me these years ago, it hasn't been fulfilled. I haven't seen it. I haven't seen it fulfilled yet. But don't misinterpret that as, I don't believe it's going to happen. I mean, it's a long wait. And, there's weariness in waiting. But we can't stop believing. We have to have that strong consolation. And I have found this to be the case. That when I find myself weary, and when I find myself doubting, I go to God and He rebolsters that strong consolation. God looks for people who will believe His word and will not doubt Him. But God notices people like that, who believe His word and don't doubt. For the eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show Himself strong in behalf of them whose heart is perfect towards Him. 2 Chronicles chapter 16, verse 9. The eyes of the Lord run to and fro throughout the earth. You know what this is telling me? It's telling me that there are some people that God tags and commissions and anoints, and there are other people that He passes by. And that's, that puts me in mind that I want to be one who upholds the character of God and says, like Abraham and Sarah, faithful is He who promised. Faithful is He who promised. If God has spoken something to me, now I understand completely that it's possible for God to speak something to me and I might misinterpret exactly what God is saying. That's possible. I mean, I'm human. Everybody's human. We find, and I've experienced even in my own life, by men and women of God that I've trusted, that at times they have somewhat misinterpreted what God has said. Or maybe, God didn't speak to them at all concerning a certain situation. That's fine. I know this much here. I know what faith tastes like. I know what faith tastes like. And so when God speaks something to me, even if I don't fully understand exactly what is being said, I'm going to hold to it. Eventually I'll know. Eventually I'll know what the outcome is supposed to be. Eventually I'll know. When I went, I pastored in Penn Yan, New York for 7 years. When I left Erie, I had faith to go to Bible school, and that was it. Within a month's time of being in Bible school, I was pastoring a church in Penn Yan, which I ended up staying there for 7 years. And you know how I knew it was the right thing? It's because, I had the faith to go to Bible school. That's all as far as I saw. But when I got to Penn Yan, the faith witnessed within my spirit. It witnessed within me that this was a divine detour, you might say. Something that God was going to use to do a work in me. And so, we don't know, but that the promises that God has given to us extend beyond the time that we are here on earth. We don't know that. I was in a certain country one time, and while I was driving through the country, the Lord Jesus Christ himself came into the back seat of my car. It was so powerful, that I almost had to pull the car over. I probably should have, actually. I think the other people on the road might have appreciated that. But there was nobody else on the road. It was in a wooded area. Not a wooded area, but through a road going through a forest. And the Lord spoke to me and said, I've given this land to you and to your children. And you know what? That's the same thing that God said to Abraham. And yet, Abraham didn't see it. So, the thing is this here. We don't know the full extent of what God has promised. All I know is this, that when I leave this earth, I want to leave it holding on to the things that God spoke, and I want to be faithful to them right to the very end. I don't want to be distracted. I don't want to be detoured. I don't want to buy into the gospel of doubt and be deviated off the path. It is, although we haven't seen it so much in our fellowship over the years, when we look at it from a long-term period, a lot of people flitting in and flitting out of churches. But in some places you go, if you go back, the next year and you see the same faces there, you're kind of surprised because people are flitting in and flitting out all the time of churches. You know what that tells me? It tells me they don't know what God's promise on their life is. Yeah, there's a period of time where there's a wandering. There's a period of time when people have to figure out where they're going. But when you find out where you're supposed to go, you know what? You're supposed to go there. There's something that God is speaking to you there. There's a corporate promise that God has brought you into. There's a land. There's an inheritance that God has brought you into. When we left the Erie church, we were sent out of the Erie church. I guess I looked at it as kind of an extension of the Erie church, actually. And that really is the appropriate way to leave a church. That really is the appropriate way to leave a church. So, the promise is extended beyond the life of Abraham. Genesis chapter 12, verses 5 through 7. And Abraham took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their substances that they had gathered, and the souls that they had gotten in Haran, and they went forth to go into the land of Canaan. And into the land of Canaan they came, and Abram passed through the land into the place Sichem, and unto the plain of Moreh, and the Canaanite was then in the land. And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord who appeared unto him. And so we have a map here. Well, we don't have it up there yet, but Becky has a map prepared for us. And so this is the Shechem right here that he's talking about. You know what that's really close to? Very close to Jerusalem. The place that God gave Abraham this promise would eventually become the nation of Israel. So as I highlighted earlier, we have a 1,000-year period before David comes on the scene, takes Jerusalem, Salem. We know Salem because that's where Abraham met Melchizedek, who was king of Salem, and Jerusalem. And all that God had promised to Abraham, he promised him in the land. Right here. That's where God gave him the promise. 1,000 years later, King David will take the city of David, will take Jerusalem and establish the capital of Israel just miles away from the very place that God spoke this to Abraham. That's the immutability of God's promise. Is there any other city in the world, any other nation in the world can make such a declaration. There isn't. Jerusalem is, well, actually will be in the millennium, will be the capital of the world. And that's the place that God promised Abraham. Such is the immutability of God's promise. And yet, within that 1,000 years, they'll spend 400 years in Egypt. They'll spend 40 years wandering in the wilderness. They'll spend 350 years in apostasy, every man doing that which is right in their own eyes. And none of that is going to be capable of keeping God from fulfilling His promise. Eventually, Solomon builds his temple on the very spot that Abraham offered Isaac, Mount Moriah. Such is the immutability. So when God gives us a promise and we lose confidence in that promise, we've lost confidence in God. Because God's promise cannot be broken. And this is the reason why this study is very timely, actually. Is because, we have to be careful the things that we embrace. I have said this for many, many years. Many, many years. I don't even know how long. That we have to be careful about the opinions that we formulate in our trials. We've got to be very careful about the things that we embrace in our trials. Next week is going to be about those who got knocked off course and didn't experience the fulfillment of it. See, the thing is this. When I stand before the Lord, I'm never going to be ashamed that I waited. Even if I never see it in my lifetime, I'll never be ashamed that I waited. I'll never be ashamed. I'll never be ashamed. I sat up there in Penyan until Brother Bailey came up there and kicked me out. And that's not exactly what happened. I'm not trying to paint Brother Bailey in a bad light here. But that's where God put me. And no matter what was going on in my life, that's where God put me. And until God sent me somewhere else, that's where God put me. And then Pastor Bailey came and he gave me the word of the Lord. He said, "Thus saith the Lord, you are to return to Erie." It did break my heart, actually, because I felt like I was leaving ahead of the time. But nevertheless, you do what God tells you to do until God tells you to do something else. It took longer than the span of Abraham's lifetime to fully complete the promise. Pastor Dan just quoted me recently. He did a good job, actually. He quotes me well. He knows me well. I live every day of my life as though revival's not coming. I really do. I get up, I read my word, I ask God to speak, I speak in tongues. I live every day of my life as though revival's never going to come, and yet I am convinced it will. I am absolutely convinced it will. But I live every day as though it's not. And I think that, to me at least, that makes perfect sense. Because I don't know in my lifetime if I'm going to see it. I trust for a long life. I hope for a long life. Please pray that I have a long life. But I don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. And so if I go before the revival comes, it's not going to benefit me any. So I have to dig, I have to plow, I have to plant every single day. As though revival's not coming. And I think this is the condition that, that we want to be in. I encourage that because, this is the thing about Abraham. The promise wasn't fulfilled in his lifetime. He didn't see it. But 1,000 years later, it happened. Well, that's okay. You don't have to bring it up. That's all right. 1,000 years later, the full cycle returned. How am I doing on time, by the way? I didn't track myself. Where are we at?
10 more minutes.
10 more minutes to cover 6 pages? Okay. That's all right. We can piecemeal it. That was my introduction, by the way. Let's read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. Don't take the promises of God lightly. Be convinced of them. There's one thing I know in my life, okay? There's one thing I know in my life, that the path that I'm on right now is the path that God put me on. And so I have to be faithful. I've got to be faithful in that path. That involves believing God through the dark times, believing God when it doesn't look like anything's going to happen, believing God when naysayers say, we waited a long time for that, still hasn't happened yet. Where do you think that's coming from? Does that sound like it's burst from the flowery clouds of heaven? Does that sound like it's coming from the rocks below? But the point for us is this, is that Abraham judged him faithful who had promised. And he believed, and because of that, he never wavered. In the end, the inheritance is still going to be given to him all the same. It's going to be given to him all the same. And you know, we have to be very careful. Preserve that inheritance, folks. I've been on the other side once or twice, and it's going to mean a lot more when you're there. A lot more. A lot more. And people are going to find that they sold out their inheritance for a mess of beans. Hold the inheritance very tightly, because the enemy's trying to take it out of your hands. Hold it very tightly. You were born for your inheritance. You weren't born for this life. And in the years to come and the eons to come, you're going to realize this ain't it. All the practical decisions we make in this life, all the things that we do to try and, enjoy the quality of life or make our lives easier or whatever the case may be, isn't going to amount to a hill of beans in heaven. It's going to be meaningless. In fact, the truth of the matter is, we have indications that we won't even remember. And yet, people spin and toil for all of these things. I'm going to bring it to a conclusion now. Is that right? Everybody okay with that? As I look out at all the dreary eyes. Yes, Pastor Frank, it's okay. Please do. Finally, my brethren. Really, I mean it. Abraham judged him faithful who had promised. You know what? Don't lose confidence in the things God's promised. Don't lose confidence in it. You are in this church and you are on this course because God joined you to a promise, an inheritance. Don't let it go. In Romans chapter 4, verses 18 to 21, this will be my last verse, even though I have many more. Romans 4:18 verse to 21, who against hope believed in hope, that he might become the father of many nations, according to that which was spoken, so shall thy seed be. And being not weak in faith, he considered not his own body, now dead, when he was about 100 years old, neither yet the deadness of Sarah's womb. Now these last parts here, don't miss them. He staggered not. He staggered not at the promise of God through unbelief. If we don't believe, we will stagger. If we don't believe, then we will doubt. That's all that's left. It's either belief or doubt. There's nothing in between. He didn't stagger through unbelief, but was strong in faith, giving glory to God. It's going to glorify God for us to finish this race. It's going to glorify Him. And being fully persuaded that what he had promised, he was able also to perform. One of our presidents said this, a man convinced against his will needs more convincing still. That's the problem with occupations. Occupations never are successful. Well, actually, there's occupation can transform into inculcation, which happened kind of during the Normans and the Saxons in England. But anyways, that's another story. But occupation doesn't really work because you're trying to convince somebody against their will. But if you convince somebody of something, and they believe it, you can walk away because they're yours. They will believe. They will believe. And so it says here that Abraham was fully persuaded, and he staggered not at the promise of God. We don't want to stagger at the promise of God. We don't want to doubt the things that God has spoken. We want to appreciate the immutability of what God has promised. It can't be broken. And if we believe that it can be broken, then it's not a ding against the promise. It's a ding against God because we haven't judged Him faithful who promised. So let's conclude this study tonight here. I almost covered half of my stuff, so we're good. But you got the idea. I mean, you guys certainly get the idea. The point is this. God spoke to Abraham in Shechem and also in Moriah. 1,000 years later, after all the journeys, after all the twistings and all the turnings, eventually God built the most glorious temple in Israel's history on that very spot. That's the immutability of what God said. It wasn't somewhere off on the other side of Jordan. It wasn't up in Syria. It wasn't, in Iraq or anything like that. It was in the very spot that Abraham offered Isaac. That's more than coincidence. That's way more than coincidence. And so I want to just commit these things to you folks. I believe that right now, like never before, the enemy is sweeping people away because they're doubting the promise of God. Because they're doubting the veracity of the things that God has spoken. And we want to hold fast. God puts us on a course. We want to stay on that course until we see it completed. Amen.